Chapter 9. The Queen. It was evening. King Harold, Queen Lilian, Countess Giovanna, and Lady Ophelia were sat in the dining hall. King Harold was the only one who felt like nothing was wrong. The serving girls and boys brought meals out for the four of them, and poured wine and water like every usual supper they had shared together. King Harold began to eat his meal, meats and vegetables. Queen Lilian ate very slowly, not having much of an appetite. Countess Giovanna picked at her food with her fork and ate a small amount of vegetables. Lady Ophelia didn't even touch her cutlery. "Are you not going to eat, Lady Ophelia?" the king asked her. "I will not eat out of respect for the dead," she said, and with that got up and left the dining room. Countess Giovanna took one last bite of her food and left too. King Harold scoffed. "Idiots, mourning the loss of a peasant," he said. Queen Lilian nodded, even though she wished she had left with them. That night, Ophelia went to Peter's room to leave the letter for him. She had tucked it into her corset again so that nobody would know. There were no guards outside Peter's room, and no guards positioned around the palace other than the regular guard. Ophelia felt sickened by the king's hatred of Peter and James's relationship, or maybe just the king's hatred of James himself. Ophelia was finding it hard to cope with the death of her friend, and couldn't even imagine how Peter must feel. She promised herself that she would be strong for him, as much as she could. She entered Peter's room, empty. It felt strange being there alone. She took the letter from her corset. Ophelia held it in her hand. For a moment she thought about reading it herself, but then didn't, respecting James's wish. She left the letter on the table for Peter to read it when he returned. The next morning, King Harold walked into the royal prison to collect Peter. "How has he been?" the king asked one of the two guards that had been guarding his cell. "He's been like this all night," the guard said, pointing at Peter. Peter was laying on the floor, motionless. The only sign of life from him was that he was shivering. "All night?" the king asked. "Yes, he didn't even eat." The king looked at the tray of ham, bread, and a glass of water. King Harold opened the cell door and crouched down next to Peter. He placed a hand on Peter's arm. He was freezing cold. The king frowned. "Peter?" No response. "It's time to leave," he told him. King Harold sighed and stood up. "Wrap him in a blanket and take him to his room. No need to guard him there," he ordered. 5 minutes later, the guard helped Peter up off the floor and draped a coarse blanket over his shoulders. Peter's cold hands took hold of it and held it around him so it wouldn't fall off. He shuffled along with the help of the guards to get back to his room. Peter sat down at his table and the guards left. For a few minutes he sat, slumped on the table, head resting on his arms. He looked up and saw a folded piece of paper in front of him, "Peter," written on it. He blinked, then leaned over to pick it up. He turned it round. It had been neatly folded into an envelope shape. He opened it. Something fell out and bounced along the table. Peter caught it under his hand and looked at it. His pearl. Peter stared at it in disbelief. He knew who the note was from now, and was hesitant to read it, but knew he had to. "My dearest Peter, if this letter has reached you, then I will no longer be here. It seems very likely that I will not be around much longer, and that scares me, not only for my sake, but for yours. I do not want you to be upset, although I know you will be. Please try to remember all the happy times we shared together. I have to tell you that I love you with all my heart and soul, and I couldn't wish for anyone else to have shared my love with. That night we spent together was the best night of my life. Even though you just held me as I cried, I felt such a deep connection to you, and to wake up and see your face was the most wonderful experience. Do not feel regretful of anything, as the time we spent together was irreplaceable. I would not trade it for anything else. To have loved you and die is better than never loving you. I hope Ophelia takes good care of you, and the two of you have a happy life together. I wish I was here to cheer the two of you on, but unfortunately that is not what fate decided. I knew you gave your pearl to me, but I thought you might want it back. All my love, James. Tears streamed down Peter's face. The last words he had from his love. He would treasure this letter forever. He held the pearl in his hand. He had not known that James carried it with him until now. Peter placed the pearl into his own pocket and sobbed onto the table. The next day, Ophelia slowly made her way to Peter's room. She knocked quietly on the door. No answer. She opened the door a little and peeked round. Peter was still sat at the table, but he had different clothes on. "Peter?" She spoke quietly. Peter looked towards her, but didn't speak. She came in, closing the door behind her, and sat on a seat next to Peter. "How are you feeling?" she asked him. "Bad," he responded, his voice raspy. "Have you slept?" she asked him, noticing the red in his eyes and the dark underneath. "Not really," he croaked. "I fell asleep a couple of times here, but not properly." She placed one of her hands on his. "I could not eat either," he told her. "You must eat something," she said, concerned. "Did my father send you?" he asked her. "No," she said. "I was worried about you." "He still let you come here. He knows I'll listen to you. It makes me not want to eat," he said, turning his head away from her. She understood him, but still wanted him to eat. "I understand, but if you don't eat, you'll get ill. I didn't eat on the day it happened, but I had a small soup yesterday to ease back into it, and now I'm able to eat again." She turned to look at the fruit bowl. "Here," she said, and pulled off a small bunch of grapes for him. "This will give you some energy." She placed them in front of him. He didn't touch them, but she left them there. "I see you read his letter," Ophelia said, noticing the open letter in front of him. He looked at her. "You brought it here?" he asked her. She nodded. "How did you get it?" "I saw him." Peter's eyes widened. "What?" He was surprised. "When?" "When you had been confined to your room, I snuck down to the prison to see him. That's when he gave me the letter," she told him. "You saw him?" he said. He sounded happy. "He told me to tell you. He loves you more than anything else in the world," she told him, a lump rising in her throat. A tear fell from Peter's eye. "I told him you felt the same way." Peter nodded, the tear falling to his lap. "I do love him more than anything in the world," he said, his voice high, trying not to cry too hard. "Were you at the—" He tried to say it, but he couldn't. She nodded. "Tell me about it," he told her. "Peter, I don't think—" He interrupted her. "Please, I have to know." He begged her. She complied. "He looked at me," she said. "He looked very scared, and he gave a little nod and a faint smile. I had to look away. My mother said after I turned away, he looked at the sky and closed his eyes. That's when she turned away." "So you were the last person he saw?" Peter said. "I guess so," Ophelia breathed, not realizing that what Peter had said was true. "That must have been a comfort to him," Peter said. "He should have seen you last," Ophelia told him, trying not to cry. "But you are his friend. I'm glad you could do what I couldn't," he let her know. She decided to go to let him get some rest and hopefully eat something. About an hour later, there was another knock at the door. Peter thought it was Ophelia coming back to see how he was. He had eaten the grapes by now. Unexpectedly, Queen Lillian opened the door. "Mother?" Peter said when he saw her. "I came to see how you were," she told him. "Right, like you care," he responded. "What?" she asked. "I've been worried about you," she said. "I don't believe that." She blinked in confusion. Peter got up from his seat. "You haven't cared about me for a long time," he said. "You didn't do anything to help me this past week." "Peter," she didn't have a response. "Do you know what I was doing this past week? I was begging Father to let James live. Not necessarily walk free, not even stay in the kingdom. Just live. I cried, screamed, begged, pleaded. So did Ophelia. Even Ophelia's mother helped until she almost got thrown in jail. The one person that could have changed Father's mind was you. Whether it would have worked or not is not the point. The point is you didn't even try. You didn't even try to help me. What kind of a mother is that? Now my heart is broken into 1,000 pieces, and my own mother didn't even try to stop it." He had tears pouring down his face, and he was angry. Queen Lillian stood still and silent for a moment, then quickly left his room without saying a thing. Peter was even more upset that she had run away, and he kicked a chair lightly. That evening, Ophelia came by Peter's room with her mother to check up on Peter. When they entered Peter's room, he was nowhere to be seen. Ophelia thought he may have gone to the toilet, but the door to Peter's bathroom was open. Where else might he have gone to? Countess Giovanna asked. Ophelia thought, then gasped. "James's room," she said. "Oh my," Giovanna responded. They quickly hurried to the servants' quarters, which was a fair walk from Peter's chambers. Both women making sure they were not seen by the king. They made it. Both women got some strange looks from the servants, although the cooks were used to royals being around. They were outside the male servants' room. The door was open, so Ophelia poked her head round. There were only 3 men in there. They were all in one area, looking confused and a little excited. She noticed they were looking at something. It was who she expected to see, but not how she had expected to find him. She walked closer. The men noticed her and backed away from who they were looking at to let her see. Peter was on James's bed. He had finally fallen asleep. He was clutching a few framed photos, and one of his hands held a small rose brooch. Ophelia almost didn't want to wake him up, as he seemed so peaceful. However, she knew he couldn't stay here. She sat down on the bed next to him and placed a hand on his arm. "Peter?" she said. He stirred a little. She leaned closer to him. "Peter," she said again. He made a noise and opened his eyes. He was confused, not knowing where he was. In a few moments, he realized he was in the servants' quarters. "You need to come back upstairs," Ophelia told him gently. "Can I have these?" Peter asked the servants about the photos and brooch. They all nodded. Peter warily walked back to the main part of the palace, with Ophelia and Giovanna. Once they had arrived back outside Peter's room, Peter turned to Countess Giovanna. "Thank you for trying to help me," he thanked her. "I'm very sorry that it didn't work." "I never met the boy, but I'm sure he was a great person," she replied. "Thank you," he spoke. "I will leave the 2 of you. I'm sorry again." She left. Peter and Ophelia entered Peter's room. He stood near the window by the table, holding the photos in his hand, the brooch pinned to his shirt. Ophelia stood in front of him. "What are you going to do with those?" she asked about the photos. "I'll have to hide them for the time being. I'll find somewhere," he told her, and leaned over her to put them on the table. Ophelia looked across his room. "Ophelia," he said, so that she would look at him. She turned to face him. She was smaller than him, so she was looking up at his face. Slowly, he leaned in towards her. She almost backed away, but didn't. He kissed her softly. Her heart fluttered in her chest and her eyes closed. She kissed him back. Once he pulled away from the kiss, she opened her eyes to look at him. "What was that for?" she asked him. "For being there for me," he told her. She smiled a little and hugged him. As they held one another, tears rolled down both of their faces. That evening, Queen Lillian returned to Peter's room to tell him something important. When she entered, she noticed Peter had fallen asleep on his bed. She walked quietly over to him. He looked flushed, from lack of sleep and grief. It reminded Queen Lillian of when Peter was little, and she would check on him in his crib to see him sound asleep. Peter was still in his clothes, and was still wearing his shoes. Queen Lillian carefully took his shoes off and placed them neatly next to his bed. She found a blanket in his wardrobe, and placed it gently over him to keep him warm. She kissed him gently on the forehead. Still, he did not stir. She left quietly. It could wait until tomorrow. Peter sat at his table. He had a small bowl of rice pudding that cook had prepared for him. He was finishing the food when there was a knock at the door. Queen Lillian entered. Peter seemed annoyed to see her. "Peter, would you please come with me?" she asked him. "I don't want to go anywhere with you," he replied. "Peter, please. It's important," she asked again. "Whatever it is, I don't want to come. It has to be today. This is the only day your father's not here," she begged. This piqued Peter's interest. "Fine, but if I don't like it, I'm coming straight back here," he told her, standing up. "That's fine," she replied. The two of them walked through the palace together. "I came to tell you about this last night, but I didn't want to wake you," she told him. Peter realized that she was the one who put the blanket over him, but didn't say anything. They arrived in an area of the palace Peter had not been in before. There was a double door in front of them, and Queen Lillian spoke. "You were right, Peter," she began. "I have been a terrible mother to you, and I know there's nothing I can do to make up for what you have suffered through. However, I hope this will help you." She pushed the door open. There was an older man in the room, but there was also a coffin. Peter gaped at the coffin. The top of the lid was open, but was facing away from Peter, Queen Lillian, and the man. Peter walked slowly towards the coffin, then turned back to his mother. "If you don't want to, you don't have to," she told him. "No, I have to see," he said. Lillian stood next to the older man. Peter made his way round to the open side of the coffin and looked in. There he was, his beautiful James. Peter's eyes filled with tears, and he leaned in close to him. He placed a hand on his face. The cold skin was strange to feel, but Peter didn't care. "Oh, James," Peter whispered, "I will never forget you, ever. I love you so much," he continued. Lillian and the man could not hear what Peter was saying. "I will remember you every day," he said, and gave him one final kiss, a tear landing on James's face. He stood up and wiped his eyes, then took the rose brooch off his shirt. "You should have this," he said to James, pinning it to his shirt. "It's still yours." He then closed the lid, savouring the last glimpse of his love. Queen Lillian walked over to Peter and put her arm round him. "You can decide where he gets buried," she told him, "and Frederick will do it today," she said. He looked at his mother, and at Frederick, who nodded. "There is a place," he said. They took the coffin to the small garden. Peter pointed to the rose bush. "There," he said, "under the rose bush." Frederick nodded. "I will have to take out the rose bush and put it back in afterwards," he told him. Peter nodded. Frederick got to work. Peter offered to help, but Frederick refused. Peter and Lillian sat together on a bench. "How did you do this?" Peter asked her. It was not difficult. He hadn't been buried yet, so I asked if he could be made up for a proper burial. Frederick agreed, and had no problem with keeping it from your father. Peter nodded. "Thank you. It really helped me," he told her. "I still want to know," he continued. "Why did you keep quiet? If you were willing to go behind Father's back and do this for me." Queen Lillian looked at the ground. "I was scared. And not just for this one thing. All the time." "Of Father?" Peter asked her. She nodded. "He scares me so much. I'm afraid to do anything that he disagrees with." "Why are you so scared of him?" Peter asked. "It started when we had just got married. He wanted to have a child so much. So did I, but not for the same reasons. He wanted an heir. We tried for a long time to get pregnant. At first, he didn't seem so bothered. He just said we had to keep trying. But as it went on, he became more and more angry with me. It wasn't anything I could do, but he still criticized me. I became scared to tell him that I still was not pregnant. A few times he struck me across the face when I told him. After 4 years, I eventually became pregnant. With you," she said to Peter. "The first thing he said to me when I told him was not encouragement or happiness. He just said, 'It better be a boy.' I was so upset that that was all he cared about. When you were finally born, he thanked the Lord that you were a boy. As did I, only because that meant I didn't have to struggle to have another child. And when you were a little boy, we had been out in the gardens together and had a picnic. You'd been having fun, running around, picking flowers. You brought one over to me as we were about to leave, and you had another one in your hand to give to your father. Your father came over to us as we reached the palace, and you gave him the flower. He took it, but then handed it to me and told me off. Why are you letting him pick flowers? He should be learning to fight and ride a horse, not playing around with flowers. And he took you by the arm and dragged you inside." She stopped talking. "Is that why you avoided me all this time? So you didn't get into trouble?" he asked her. "Yes," she told him. "I know it's silly. I do love you, Peter, I promise. I've just been so scared that I—" She got cut off by Peter hugging her tightly. "I forgive you," he told her. "I never knew he treated you that way." He let go. "After you spoke to me the other day, Peter, I decided enough was enough. I have to stop being so scared of him and do this for you," she told him. Peter smiled at her. "There are 2 of us now," he told her, holding her hands. "I will not let him hurt you anymore," Peter told her. Peter then thought, "Wait, how come you decided to marry him? Your marriage wasn't arranged," he asked her. "Oh, when your father first met me, he seemed kind, polite, charming, everything that a fine man should be. He was a lovely person and made me feel happy, and my father was very happy for me to marry him. It was only after we were married that his real colours showed. But by then it was too late. I couldn't leave him without being shamed." Peter looked sad. "That's terrible," he breathed. "But like you said," Queen Lillian spoke, "there are 2 of us now, and we can be there for each other." They both smiled. Frederick had finally dug the hole, and he lowered the coffin into the ground with the help of Peter and Queen Lillian. Peter helped to fill the hole back in by pushing the dirt into the hole with his bare hands, while Frederick used the shovel. Eventually, the hole was filled in, and Peter placed the rose bush back in the ground and patted it in securely. Frederick poured a little water on it. Peter stood back to look at it. That was James's gift to him, that James would continue to help grow from the ground. Peter let Ophelia know about it when she returned home from town that evening. Queen Lillian walked into her room. King Harold was in bed reading a book in the candlelight. She walked over to him and stood there until he looked at her. "Yes?" he asked, confused. She crossed her arms. "I have spent almost our whole married life putting up with you," she began. "I have spent most of it being scared of you and doing exactly as you say to try to please you. But no more." The king looked even more confused. "From now on, I will not be staying in this room with you. I will not spend much time with you at all. I will only spend time with you at public events and meal times when I have to sit at the same table." The king opened his mouth to speak, and then shut it. "If that is what you want," he said. "But what is this about? Is it about that boy?" he asked. "This is many, many years of me bending to your every will. Me abandoning my son to try and please you. Me struggling through years of trying to get pregnant for you. Me giving up my life to be with you. The boy was the final straw. It broke my son's heart, and I will not stand for that," she told him bluntly. "Our son," he tried to correct her. "My!" she shouted. "My son." She narrowed her eyes at him. "You are no father to him. You never have been, and you never will be." He blinked at her. "I will move my belongings in my own time when you are not here," she told him, then elegantly turned around, picked up her nightgown, and left the room. Peter walked towards his room when he spotted his mother. "Mother?" he spoke. She turned to look at him. "Why are you about at this hour?" he asked her. "I told your father I would not spend any more time with him," she told him. "Good," Peter responded. "He doesn't deserve you. However, I now have to find somewhere to sleep." Peter thought for a moment. "You could have the room that me and Ophelia were supposed to have," he said. "You're not moving into it?" she asked. "No, we're keeping my room. I can see the rosebush from my room," he told her. "Only if you're sure I can use it." "Of course you can." She smiled at him and kissed him on the cheek. Queen Lillian was about to walk away. "But," Peter grabbed her arm, "can you stay with me tonight?" She looked at him. "So I can sleep?" She saw how upset he looked. "Of course," she told him, and followed him to his room. A couple of days passed, and Peter managed to sleep better with his mother being in the room with him. She had stayed both nights. He looked healthier, and finally had the energy to go practice with the knights. They were unaware what had happened, but they realized that he seemed more aggressive than usual. Peter was taking all his angry emotions out in his fighting practice with the knights. The knights were happy to be kept on their feet, but were a little worried about Peter. After practice, one of the knights pulled Peter aside. "Sire, are you all right? You seem rather angry today," he asked. "Something happened recently. I need an outlet for the emotions that I'm feeling," he told the knight. "Well, all right. Don't let it get the best of you, though. We like to see a kind spirit around here," the knight said, and left. Peter was surprised at what the knight had said. Maybe everyone wasn't as stuck up as he thought. Maybe he had just been forced into spending time with the wrong people. Now that he could distance himself from his father, he could spend time with more decent people. It was evening, and the first time everyone had all been in the same room since James's passing. King Harold was at the head of the table. Queen Lillian and Countess Giovanna were sat closest to him, and Peter and Ophelia were sat next to each other. There was a silence while the serving boys and girls brought out lamb and vegetables. They poured wine and water for the family. "It is good to see you out of your room, Peter," King Harold said. Peter ignored him. The king did not like this. "How long are you going to ignore me?" he asked. Peter looked at him. "Don't talk to me," Peter said stubbornly. "When my mother passed, I only grieved for a day," the king said. Peter's jaw clenched, and the others all looked towards the king in disgust. "And she wasn't a peasant," he added. Peter grabbed his sharp knife and strode over to the king. He stood behind him, using his right arm to hold him back against the chair, and he put his knife up to the king's throat with his left hand. A couple of guards began to move to protect the king. However, King Harold held up his hand to stop the guards from helping. "Go on then," King Harold urged Peter to do it, the three of us and the serving staff looking on in suspense. "If this is what you really want." The king spoke again. He was almost sure that Peter wouldn't do it. "Oh, you have no idea how much I want to." Peter hissed in his ear. He paused. "But I'm not going to," he said, "because it won't solve anything. Killing you won't bring him back. And," he paused and made sure his mouth was right next to the king's ear, "I don't kill people just to please myself." Peter stabbed the knife into the table next to King Harold's plate. "Remember that." He let go of the king and strode out of the dining hall. Lady Ophelia got up and left as well. The other two ladies stayed to eat, but didn't speak. The king didn't eat any more, and left shortly after.